Welcome to Grandma True Stories. Please remember to subscribe and also share this story to your loved one. Thank you. My name is Margaret Ellsworth, and I am 82 years old. People around here call me Maggie, though lately, it seems fewer and fewer even bother. I've lived in Willow Creek my whole life, a small Midwestern town where people still wave at you from their porches, even if they've heard every piece of gossip about you by sundown. I spent 47 years married to a man named Charles, who built the Ellsworth Trucking Company from nothing but a second-hand flatbed and a stubborn will. Together, we raised one son, my only child, Daniel. Charles passed 5 years ago, and with him went the sound of someone calling my name like it mattered. I thought losing him was the hardest thing I'd face. I was wrong. What happened after that, what my own son allowed to happen, has burned a scar across my soul deeper than death ever could. It started on a windy November morning, the kind that rattled the windows and made the old maple out front groan like it wanted to be put out of its misery. I was in the upstairs bedroom, folding away sweaters, when the phone rang. It was Martin Graves, the family lawyer. His voice was as calm as always, but there was something in his tone that made me set down the sweater without finishing the fold. "Maggie," he said, "I think you should come by my office this afternoon. There's an important matter we need to discuss. And I think Daniel and his wife will be there too." My stomach nodded instantly. Martin had been handling our affairs for decades. He didn't call meetings unless something serious was brewing. When I arrived at the office, I saw them immediately, Daniel and his wife Vanessa, sitting side by side in the waiting area. Daniel didn't stand to greet me. He just glanced up, gave me the kind of tight smile you give to a stranger in the grocery aisle, and went back to staring at the floor. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked me up and down like I was an uninvited guest at her private party. She was wearing a beige cashmere coat and a scarf that probably cost more than my monthly pension. I sat down 2 chairs away. No one spoke. The ticking of the clock on the wall was louder than any of us. Martin's assistant finally opened the door, and we were led into his office. My heart was pounding like I was walking into a courtroom. In some ways, I was. Martin's office smelled faintly of leather and old books. He closed the door behind us and motioned for everyone to sit. I took my seat at the far end of the table, my hands clasped so tightly they ached. Daniel sat to my right, Vanessa on his other side. Martin cleared his throat. "As you know," he began, "Charles left a substantial estate, property, company shares, and various investments. After certain sales and acquisitions over the past few years, the total value has been appraised at approximately $213 million. The number barely registered. It might as well have been $200. I had never cared about the money. What I cared about was family. But family, I was about to learn, cared very differently about me." Martin was still talking when I caught the sound, faint, sharp, like a snake in the grass. Vanessa had leaned toward Daniel, her lips brushing just near his ear. I couldn't hear every word, but the ones I did catch were enough to freeze the air in my lungs. "She's not family. She gets nothing from the estate." Her voice was silky, poisoned. I turned my eyes toward her, but she didn't even flinch, didn't even look in my direction. She just sat back and crossed her legs, one manicured hand resting casually on Daniel's arm. My own son didn't correct her. He didn't say, "That's my mother." He didn't even look at me. That was the moment something inside me cracked. I didn't speak, not yet. My chest was heavy with a mixture of disbelief and grief that felt too big to put into words. I had been there when Daniel was born, 13 hours of labor, sweat pouring down my face, praying he'd come out breathing and healthy. I had packed his school lunches, worked nights at the diner so he could go to college, and held him through heartbreaks I thought would destroy him. And now he was letting the woman he married erase me from my own family's legacy. My legacy. The shame didn't just belong to him, it settled over me too, as if I had failed somewhere in raising him. Martin must have noticed the shift in the room, because his voice slowed and his eyes moved between us. "Before we go further, there's something I want to make clear," he said. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet ring box. For a moment, no one moved. He set it in front of him, resting his hand over it like it was a holy relic. Charles left something specific in his will, something that is not to be touched, sold, or claimed by anyone except its intended recipient. And that recipient is in this room. Vanessa's lips curled, almost like she was preparing to claim it herself. Daniel sat straighter. My pulse drummed in my ears. When Martin slid the box toward me, Vanessa's eyes widened, just for a moment, before narrowing like a shutter closing over a lens. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The velvet felt soft, almost warm, under my fingertips. I didn't open it. I couldn't, not yet. Martin continued, "Your husband was a man of few words, Maggie, but he left a note with this. I believe you should read it privately. The contents of this box, and the meaning behind it, will matter greatly in the days ahead." His voice carried weight I couldn't quite place. Vanessa crossed her arms, her knuckles turning white. Daniel still wouldn't look at me. Somewhere deep inside, a part of me began to wake up, the part that had been dormant since Charles died, the part that remembered I was not a woman easily erased. I left Martin's office with the box in my coat pocket and 1,000 questions in my mind. The cold November air bit into my cheeks, but I barely felt it. I kept replaying Vanessa's whisper, the casual cruelty of it. I thought of the years I had tried to welcome her into the family, cooking her favorite meals, remembering her birthday, even giving her the diamond brooch that had belonged to my own mother. And for what? To be told I was not family? As I walked to my car, I realized something important. If they wanted me out of the way, it meant there was more at stake than I'd been told. And whatever was in that ring box might just be the key. At home, I sat at the kitchen table, the box in front of me. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat. I ran my fingers along the edge of the lid, remembering how Charles used to hide my Christmas gifts in plain sight just to see if I'd guess what they were. My breath was unsteady as I lifted the lid. Inside was a ring, gold, heavy, with a deep green emerald that caught the light like it was alive. Underneath it, folded small enough to fit in the box, was a piece of paper. My name was written in Charles's handwriting, bold and certain. My hands shook as I opened it. The first line made me gasp. The second line made me cry. "Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and they've started circling like vultures. This ring is not just a gift. It's proof. Keep it safe. Trust no one, not even Daniel. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." My tears blurred the ink, but the words were already seared into my mind. Proof? Of what? And why would Charles tell me not to trust our own son? I set the letter down, my heart pounding with a mix of grief and adrenaline. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about something deeper, something my husband had known would happen after he was gone. And now it was my turn to carry the weight of whatever he'd left behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa's smirk, heard her whisper. I saw Daniel's silence. I saw Charles's face in my memory, the way he'd look at me when something was serious but he wasn't ready to explain. I knew then that I couldn't just sit back and let them strip away what was mine, not the money, not the house, not even the memory of who I was in this family. I had no plan yet, but I had the ring, the letter, and the stubborn Ellsworth blood that had built an empire. If they thought I was going quietly, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. If you've been with me this far, you know the storm is just beginning. In the next chapter of the story, I'll tell you exactly what happened when I decided to dig into the truth behind Charles's mysterious proof, and why it made my daughter-in-law wish she'd never crossed me. Stay with me, it's about to get dangerous. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the wind dragging dead leaves across the porch. My coffee tasted bitter, not because I'd brewed it wrong, but because my mind was still locked on Charles's words, trust no one, not even Daniel. The ring box sat in front of me on the kitchen table, the emerald catching every sliver of light through the curtains. Proof. Proof of what? And why a ring? Charles wasn't the type for sentimental puzzles. If he left something, it had a reason, and that reason was usually as solid as the steel he'd built his trucks from. I decided I couldn't just sit in the house waiting for answers to fall into my lap. I had to start somewhere. The only logical place was the man who had handed me the ring in the first place, Martin Graves. He'd been our lawyer for decades, had been at our wedding, had stood beside Charles through every business deal and lawsuit. If anyone knew what proof meant, it would be him. I picked up the phone and called his office. His assistant, a young man named Rick, said Martin was in meetings all day. But his tone told me it wasn't just business keeping me out. Something in my gut said Martin was protecting something. Instead of going to Martin, I went to the one place Charles had always said held the real records, his old office at the Ellsworth Trucking headquarters. The company had been sold 2 years after Charles died, but the new owners hadn't gutted the place. I still had a key. The building smelled the same, motor oil, dust, and the faint scent of Charles's cologne embedded in the wood. His old desk was still there, the drawers mostly empty, except for a few forgotten receipts and an ancient paperclip. But in the bottom drawer, hidden under the lining, I found it, a false bottom. I pressed my fingers against it until it popped loose. Inside was a thick envelope with my name on it. My heart thumped so hard I could hear it. I opened it, expecting maybe another letter. Instead, it was a stack of documents, property deeds, share certificates, and one thing that made my hands shake, a sealed envelope marked "Only open if threatened." I didn't open it right there. Something in me knew I had to be careful. If Charles had hidden it this way, there was a reason. And I couldn't forget Vanessa's face at Martin's office, like she was already mentally spending every penny of the estate. I took the papers home, locked the doors, and sat at the kitchen table again. I stared at that sealed envelope for a long time, wondering what threatened truly meant. Did it mean legal threats? Physical danger? The loss of my home? I didn't know yet, but my instincts told me it was tied to that ring. So I examined the ring again. This time, I noticed something, very faint engraving along the inside of the band. It wasn't a date or initials. It was a number. A long number. The kind you'd see on a safe deposit box. The bank in town had been around as long as the Ellsworth family name. My name was still on a few accounts there, so I decided to test my theory. I walked into the marble-floored lobby, the ring in my pocket, and asked to speak to the vault manager. She looked at the number I gave her and nodded slowly, as if she recognized it. "That's a legacy box," she said. "Been here for decades. But I'll need to see the key and the ID of the listed owner." My stomach dropped. The key. Charles hadn't left me one. But I remembered something. Charles always kept spares hidden in plain sight. Back home, I tore through the garage, checking every jar of screws, every tool chest, even the pockets of his old work coats. Finally, in an old cigar tin, I found it, small, brass, and worn smooth from use. The bank let me in that afternoon. The manager led me into a cold, windowless room lined with metal drawers. My hands trembled as I slid the key in and pulled out the box. Inside were more documents, but not the kind I expected, photos, too. Dozens of them. Some were of Charles in his younger years, others were of Daniel as a boy, but then there were ones that didn't make sense at all. The later photos showed Charles with a man I didn't recognize, shaking hands in what looked like a backroom office. In another, Charles was standing next to a plot of land with heavy machinery digging deep trenches. And then, one that made my blood run cold, Charles standing next to Daniel, who looked about 20, holding a check for $5 million. That check was made out to a company I had never heard of. And stamped across the top in red ink were the words, "Confidential settlement, do not disclose." I sat back, my mind spinning. What had my son been involved in that required a $5 million settlement? And why had Charles kept these photos hidden instead of confronting me? I knew then that the proof might not be about keeping me in the estate, it might be about protecting the family name from something explosive. If Vanessa ever got her hands on this, she could destroy us, or worse, use it to control Daniel. Suddenly, the inheritance wasn't just about money, it was leverage. That night, I locked the photos and documents in my own safe, the kind even a locksmith would have trouble with. But the unease in my stomach wouldn't leave. Charles's warning, "Trust no one," rang louder than ever. I realized that if Martin had known about the ring, he might also know about the deposit box. And if he knew, so could Vanessa. I couldn't let them know I'd been there. The problem was, I'd already left a trail at the bank. The next morning, my phone rang. It wasn't Martin. It was Vanessa. Her voice was honey-sweet, which was how I knew she wanted something. "Margaret," she said, "Daniel and I were thinking, maybe we could have you over for dinner this week. You know, talk things through. Clear the air." My gut told me it was a trap. But part of me wanted to see them, just to gauge how much they knew. "Sure," I said, keeping my voice even. "Thursday works." As soon as I hung up, I slipped the ring into my pocket and whispered to myself, "You're not going to see me coming." You've seen the first crack in their plan, but in the next chapter of the story, the dinner table becomes a battlefield. I'll tell you exactly what they tried to pull that night, and how one small slip from Vanessa gave me the upper hand. You won't believe what she let slip. Stay tuned. Thursday came faster than I expected. By the time the sun dipped behind the rows of bare maple trees, I was standing in front of Daniel and Vanessa's sprawling two-story colonial, the one with the perfect white shutters and a front lawn clipped like a golf course. I'd only been there a handful of times, always as a guest, never as family. Tonight, I wasn't sure which role I was supposed to play, if any. The ring sat in my coat pocket, its weight a steady reminder that I had a card they didn't know I could play. Vanessa opened the door before I even knocked. "Margaret," she said, all smile and sparkle, her perfume wafting into the cold night air. Come in, come in." Her voice was warm, but her eyes were as cold as the frost gathering on the driveway. Daniel appeared behind her, hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said, flatly, like my name was just another word in his vocabulary. He didn't hug me. I stepped inside, my heels clicking on their polished hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic, but also of something artificial, like the scent was trying too hard to say home. The dining table was set for 3, each place setting marked with gold-rimmed plates and crystal wine glasses. I took the seat opposite the two of them, my back to the large bay window. Vanessa poured me a glass of red wine before I could even refuse. "I thought we could have a nice, calm dinner," she said, sitting beside Daniel. "No lawyers, no drama. Just talking." I smiled faintly, though my mind was already cataloging every detail, the way Daniel avoided my eyes, the way Vanessa's hands rested on the table, palms down, like she was pinning something in place. The first 20 minutes were filled with small talk, which was more uncomfortable than silence. Vanessa asked if I'd settled in after Charles's death, as if that were a fresh event instead of something I'd been living with for 5 years. Daniel asked about my health in a tone that made it sound like he was asking about the weather. Then, just as Vanessa brought out the roast chicken, she dropped it. "You know, Margaret, we've been thinking a lot about the estate," she said casually, slicing into the bird. "We just want to make sure things go smoothly. It's such a large amount, $213 million. It would be a shame if it got complicated." My fork froze midair. There it was, the real reason I was here. I set it down slowly, keeping my voice calm. "Complicated?" I asked. Vanessa gave a little shrug. "Well, you know, it's not exactly common for in-laws to inherit. The family name is important, and Daniel and I are the ones carrying it forward. It's tradition." She looked at Daniel, who nodded slightly, though he still couldn't meet my eyes. I took a sip of wine to buy myself a moment. "And what about Charles's traditions?" I asked softly. "Or do those only count when they benefit you?" That hit a nerve. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she recovered quickly. Of course, we respect Charles's wishes, she said, her smile just a little too tight. But there's also practicality to consider. You're in the later chapter of life, and managing something like this can be overwhelming. We'd be happy to handle everything on your behalf. The way she said later chapter of life felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. I smiled back, the kind of smile Charles once told me could freeze a man at 20 paces. I'm sure you would, I said. The conversation drifted for a while, but I noticed something. Vanessa kept glancing at my coat draped over the back of my chair. Once, when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes flickered down toward the pocket where the ring sat. That's when I realized something important. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to suspect the ring mattered. I decided to test her. Funny thing, I said, picking up my wineglass. Charles left me a little keepsake. Said it was proof of something. I'm still trying to figure out what he meant. Vanessa's knife slipped, scraping the plate. She covered it with a laugh, but her eyes betrayed her, just for a second. Daniel's head turned sharply toward me, his brow furrowing. Proof? He asked, his voice low. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Yes. Something about trusting no one. Even you. The room went silent. I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock over the sound of my own heartbeat. Vanessa recovered first, setting down her fork. Well, Charles always did love his riddles, she said, her tone light but her knuckles pale against the tablecloth. Dinner ended not long after, but not before Vanessa made her final move. As I stood to get my coat, she placed her hand on my arm, her nails digging in just slightly. Margaret, she said softly, so Daniel couldn't hear, I hope you'll think carefully about what you do with that keepsake. Sometimes the past is better left buried. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I looked right at her, matching her sweetness with steel. And sometimes, I said, the past is the only thing that can save the future. I walked out without another word. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the ring in front of me, Charles's note beside it. Vanessa's slip at the table had told me one thing for certain, whatever Charles had left me, it wasn't just about money. It was about something she desperately didn't want me to find. And if she didn't want me to find it, then finding it was exactly what I was going to do. The morning after that dinner, I woke with my decision made. I wasn't going to wait for Martin, or Daniel, or anyone else to tell me what Charles meant. I'd follow the trail myself. The engraving inside the ring still tugged at my thoughts, the number like a whisper I couldn't unhear. The safe deposit box had given me documents and photographs, but there was one detail in those photos I hadn't noticed until last night, a street sign in the background of one shot, barely visible, half hidden by a telephone pole. I spent an hour with a magnifying glass over those photos. Finally, I could just make it out, Hawthorne and Creekside. That intersection was way out on the edge of Willow Creek, where the old industrial park sat abandoned since the late 90s. Most of those buildings had been left to rot, windows busted out, roofs sagging. It wasn't a place people went, unless they had a reason not to be seen. That thought alone was enough to make me grab my coat, slip the ring into my pocket, and head for my car. The drive took less than 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to change, colder, quieter, as if even the wind knew better than to linger here. I pulled up alongside a chain-link fence with a faded no trespassing sign, the kind that had been ignored so long it had lost its authority. The building from the photo was unmistakable, brick walls streaked with rust, a loading dock sagging under years of neglect. I checked over my shoulder before slipping through a gap in the fence. Inside, the place smelled of mold and oil. My footsteps echoed across the cracked concrete floor. I passed piles of warped pallets and old machinery draped in cobwebs. In one corner, under a broken skylight, I found what I was looking for, a heavy steel door with a rusted lock. The exact spot from one of the photographs. My hands shook as I touched it. This was where Charles had stood with that unknown man. Why? The lock was old, but not stubborn. It gave way after a few twists of the screwdriver I'd brought from home. The door groaned open into a narrow hallway. The air was cooler here, and dust motes danced in the thin beam of light from my flashlight. At the end of the hall, there was another door, this one newer, sturdier, with a keypad lock. That stopped me cold. Keypads meant codes, and codes meant someone still cared about keeping this place sealed. I thought about turning back. But then I remembered Vanessa's face at the dinner table, the way she'd said, "Sometimes the past is better left buried." That was all the push I needed. I examined the keypad and almost laughed, Charles's stubborn old habits. He'd used the same 4-digit code for years, my birthday. I punched it in. The lock clicked. Beyond the door was a small office, the kind you might expect in a shipping warehouse, metal desk, filing cabinets, an ancient computer monitor. But what caught my attention wasn't the furniture. It was the safe in the corner. Not a tiny personal safe, but a waist-high industrial one, bolted to the floor. I knew instantly the ring's engraving wasn't just for the bank box, it was for this, too. The numbers matched. I turned the combination, my pulse loud in my ears. When the safe door swung open, I froze. Inside were 3 thick binders, each labeled in Charles's handwriting. The first read, Ellsworth Holdings, Private Accounts. The second, Settlements and Agreements. And the third, Hawthorne Project. I pulled the last one out and flipped it open right there. The Hawthorne Project was massive. Blueprints, contracts, purchase orders for heavy machinery, all dated about 20 years ago. But there was more, letters from an environmental lawyer warning of contamination in the soil, medical records showing unexplained illnesses in residents nearby, and most chilling of all, signatures. Not just Charles's, but Daniel's. My son's name was on documents authorizing payments to silence families affected by the contamination. I sat down hard in the desk chair, my hands gripping the pages. This was it. This was the proof. Charles had been involved, maybe reluctantly, in something dangerous, something that could ruin the Ellsworth name if it came out. And Daniel. Daniel hadn't just known. He'd signed off on it. The $5 million settlement photo suddenly made sense. It wasn't just a business payout, it was hush money. The realization hit me like ice water. If Vanessa knew about this, she could use it to control Daniel, to keep him under her thumb, maybe even to manipulate the entire estate. And if the wrong person got their hands on these binders, we'd all be done for. My first instinct was to take everything. My second was to burn it all. But Charles's note stopped me. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. I locked the binders back in the safe, memorizing every detail, then closed the steel door behind me. As I stepped back out into the daylight, I had the strangest feeling I wasn't alone. I glanced around, but the lot was empty. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck were up. I didn't run, I walked calmly to my car, slid behind the wheel, and drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a car I didn't recognize parked across the street, a black sedan, windows tinted dark. It pulled away the moment I stepped out of my car. My stomach dropped. Either this was a coincidence, or someone knew exactly where I'd been. They're watching me now. In the next chapter of the story, I'll tell you what happened when I decided to turn the game around, using their surveillance to lead them straight into a trap. But what I didn't expect was the person I'd catch following me. The air in that room could have been cut with a butter knife. Every tick of the grandfather clock behind the lawyer seemed to echo like a drumbeat in my chest. Tiffany sat in her seat with her arms crossed, the faint scent of her overpowering perfume mixing with the wood polish in the office. My son, Jacob, sat stiffly beside her, staring down at his expensive watch as if it might save him from whatever was about to be revealed. The lawyer's eyes, however, never left me. They weren't just looking, they were measuring. I could tell. That faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth told me he knew something none of us were ready for. My fingers brushed against the edge of the polished table, steadying myself. I had been blindsided before, but this felt different. This felt like a storm was gathering just beyond the door. Mrs. Henderson, the lawyer began, his voice low and deliberate, "Before we proceed, I need to ask you a very important question." His words made Tiffany shift in her seat, the leather squeaking under her impatient movements. She rolled her eyes in a way she must have thought was subtle. Jacob still refused to look up. I swallowed hard, keeping my gaze fixed on the lawyer. "What question?" I asked, my voice calm, though I could feel my pulse in my ears. He slid a thick manila envelope toward me, the seal unbroken. "Do you recognize this?" My hands trembled slightly as I reached for it, the paper cool against my fingertips. My breath caught when I saw the handwriting on the front, my late husband's. Bold, confident strokes, spelling out my full name as if he were right there in the room. My throat tightened instantly. Tiffany let out a small laugh, the kind of laugh meant to mock. "What is this? Another love letter from the past?" "We're here to talk about assets, not sentiment." I didn't even bother to look at her. My eyes stayed locked on the letter, my mind spinning back to nights when my husband would sit at his desk, scribbling things he never let me read. The lawyer slid a silver letter opener across the table. "I was instructed to deliver this to you, and only you, before the will was read in its entirety," he said. Tiffany shifted again, this time leaning toward Jacob and whispering something I couldn't hear. My son's jaw tightened. I hesitated for only a second before sliding the opener under the flap and breaking the seal. The sound seemed impossibly loud. The folded paper inside was thick, expensive, the kind my husband always favored. I unfolded the letter slowly, my heart pounding with every crease I smoothed out. The handwriting inside was just as I remembered, precise, strong, almost stubborn. "My dearest Evelyn," it began. I could feel Tiffany's eyes boring into me, desperate to know what it said. My husband's words seemed to lift off the page, pulling me back to the man I had loved for over 4 decades. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the people in this room are not who you think they are." My breath hitched. I read the sentence again, my stomach twisting. My eyes darted to Jacob, then Tiffany. They looked uncomfortable now, though trying to mask it. "I have taken steps to ensure that what is rightfully yours remains yours. The truth will not be found in the will alone. Trust Mr. Hensley. And, Evelyn, trust no one else." The room felt smaller, hotter. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably, her polished facade cracking just a little. Jacob cleared his throat and finally looked at me, his eyes a mixture of confusion and something else, something that looked a lot like guilt. "What does it say?" Tiffany asked, her voice sharp now, no longer pretending to be sweet. I folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. "It says," I replied slowly, "that my husband trusted me, and that I should be very careful who else I trust." The lawyer nodded almost imperceptibly, as if to confirm the truth of my words. Tiffany scoffed and turned to Jacob. "She's stalling. This is ridiculous. Let's get on with it." But I knew now, there was more to this meeting than they had planned for. And if my husband had left hidden truths, then this was only the beginning. The air in the lawyer's office felt thick, charged with a tension I hadn't expected. I sat rigid, the velvet ring box resting heavily in my hands, as if the weight of everything I'd lost and everything I might gain pressed down on me. The green emerald in the ring caught the light softly, its glow almost like a whisper from Charles, something he had hidden from the world but wanted me to find. Mr. Graves leaned forward, his voice low and grave. "Mrs. Ellsworth, your late husband was a man who believed in protecting his legacy, not just through wills or money, but through secrets. This ring is a key to documents, to truths that have been kept from you." I traced the faint engraving inside the band, a cryptic code, indecipherable to anyone but me. "What kind of truths?" I asked. He opened a worn envelope filled with papers and photos. Evidence of agreements, settlements, and a story behind this estate that no one outside this room knows. I pulled out a photo that made my heart stop, a younger Daniel holding a check for $5 million, marked confidential settlement. Letters warned of lawsuits. Other photos showed Charles with a stranger in shadowed meetings. Vanessa's calm cracked ever so slightly. Daniel's jaw clenched tight. I realized this wasn't just about inheritance, it was a tangled web of family secrets, money, and betrayal. I folded the papers carefully. I need to know everything. If Charles wanted me to protect this legacy, I have to understand what it really means. The days after that lawyer's meeting blurred into an endless loop of restless nights and anxious mornings. The ring's emerald gleamed from the kitchen table, surrounded by photographs, letters, and documents that whispered secrets I wasn't ready to face. Every glance at Daniel felt like looking through a pane of frosted glass. He was there, but distant, his eyes avoiding mine like a man trying to forget a haunting. Vanessa was no different. Her smiles were sharp, her words clipped. I caught her once watching me from across the room, her eyes cold, calculating. I knew then that the estate battle was more than money, it was a war of shadows and whispers. One day, unable to bear the silence, I went to the bank where Charles had kept his safe deposit box. The receptionist gave me a once-over, her polite smile strained with suspicion as I handed over the lawyer's letter. Finally, I was led to a cold, windowless room where the boxes were kept. The metal box slid open with a heavy clang that echoed in the stillness. Inside, stacks of papers, photographs, and folders lay like relics of a forgotten war. I pulled out letters bound with a faded ribbon, contracts with signatures that danced between familiar and strange, and photos of Charles with a man I'd never met, Leonard Mills. The letters were filled with warnings, threats from business rivals, negotiations to silence lawsuits, and frantic plans to shield the Ellsworth fortune from ruin. One photograph froze my breath, a young Daniel holding a check for $5 million, stamped confidential settlement. The truth was staggering. The estate's fortune was built on a foundation of hush money, betrayal, and shadows. Vanessa's perfect mask faltered briefly when she saw the photo. Daniel's jaw tightened like steel. The family I thought I knew was fractured beneath the surface. Determined, I read further. Among the documents was a letter from Charles to Leonard Mills, written just months before he died. Leonard, it began, if the truth is exposed, everything we've built will fall. I'm entrusting you with the legacy, but warn you, this path is dangerous. My pulse quickened. Leonard Mills, who was he? What had Charles hidden from me? And why had Daniel never mentioned him? I knew I couldn't sit back and wait for answers to come to me. Following a clue in the correspondence, I found Leonard's P.O. box in a small nearby town. The post office clerk offered little, but I left a note, hoping he would respond. As I turned to leave, a man stepped out from the shadows. Tall, sharp-eyed, with a voice calm but firm, "Mrs. Ellsworth? I'm Leonard. We need to talk." He led me to a quiet cafe, where over cups of bitter coffee, he unraveled the hidden story. Charles had been caught in a dangerous web of corruption. Business deals disguised as philanthropy, payoffs to silence families affected by environmental damage, and threats from powerful enemies. Leonard confessed that Charles had wanted to protect his family, but those secrets had a price. Now, with Charles gone, others sought to erase the past, bury the truth, and seize control. The estate is more than money, Leonard said, eyes steady. It's a battleground. I left the cafe with the sun setting behind me, the weight of what I'd learned pressing down like never before. This was no longer about inheritance. It was about survival. The sun was just beginning to rise when I sat at my kitchen table, the weight of Leonard's revelations pressing heavily on my shoulders. The ring, once a symbol of love and unity, now felt like a silent challenge, an unspoken call to fight for a legacy tangled in lies and danger. The documents and photos spread out before me painted a portrait of a man I thought I knew, but who had lived a double life shadowed by threats and secrets. For days, I wrestled with the choice before me. To expose the truth meant risking everything, my family, my safety, and the fragile peace I'd clung to since Charles's passing. But to stay silent would be to betray the man I loved and the values he fought for in the quiet corners of his world. Then came the phone call. A voice, calm but chilling, warned me to back down. Mrs. Ellsworth, some truths are better left buried. You don't want to become a casualty in a war you don't understand. I hung up, heart racing. That was no idle threat. It was a warning from the shadows. Determined, I reached out to old friends of Charles, people who had once stood by him but had since disappeared from sight. One by one, they opened doors to the past, revealing a network of allies and enemies tangled in the estate's web. I discovered that Charles had been quietly funding environmental causes, supporting communities damaged by corporate negligence, and fighting a battle most of us never saw. But those efforts had made him powerful enemies, people who wanted to silence him and anyone who knew too much. As I dug deeper, I uncovered hidden bank accounts, secret trusts, and documents indicating a plan Charles had devised to protect the estate's true beneficiaries, people far removed from the gilded halls of our family home. Each discovery brought new dangers. Strange cars appeared outside my house. Unmarked letters filled my mailbox. Vanessa's thinly veiled hostility grew sharper, and Daniel's silence turned to open avoidance. One evening, as I returned from a meeting with an old friend who had helped Charles decades ago, I noticed the garden gate was ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The door to the house was unlocked, an intrusion meant to unsettle, to warn. But I wasn't about to give up. For Charles. For my family. For the truth. The battle for the $213 million estate was no longer a legal dispute. It was a war for justice, redemption, and survival. The night air was thick with tension as I sat alone in the living room, the faint glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls. The invasion of my home wasn't just an act of intimidation, it was a declaration. Someone was watching, waiting for me to falter. But I wasn't about to back down. I had spent weeks piecing together the fragments Charles had left behind, his secret alliances, his battles, and the true story of the estate. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. Daniel and Vanessa had grown distant, their smiles hollow and their words laced with thinly veiled resentment. It was clear they were no longer just opponents in a legal fight, they were part of a deeper scheme to control the fortune and silence me. One evening, the confrontation finally came. At a family gathering meant to appear cordial, Vanessa's mask slipped completely. She whispered threats masked as warnings, her eyes cold as steel. You don't belong here, Evelyn. This estate isn't yours. I met her gaze steadily. The estate belongs to truth and justice, not to those who hide behind lies. Her laughter was bitter. You're fighting a losing battle. But I had news for her. I wasn't alone. A trusted ally from Charles's past arrived with proof, documents that exposed the corrupt deals and the lengths some would go to keep the truth hidden. The room fell silent as the evidence was laid bare. For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. The facade cracked, revealing the man caught between loyalty and greed. That night, I realized the fight wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming a legacy stolen by betrayal and silence. And I was ready to win. The morning sun streamed through the window, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold knot tightening in my chest. After years of silence, betrayal, and secrets, the final chapter of this story was unfolding, and it was more intense than I ever imagined. The evidence brought by my ally had shattered the fragile mask Daniel and Vanessa wore. The truth about the estate, the hush money, and the hidden battles was now out in the open. The room that once held whispers and threats now echoed with confessions and revelations. I stood tall, feeling a surge of strength I hadn't known I possessed. This wasn't just about the money, it was about justice for Charles, for me, and for the family legacy he had fought so hard to protect. As the dust settled, the lawyer returned with one last surprise. The real key to the estate wasn't just in documents or money, it was in the ring, and in the vow Charles had left behind. He handed me the small ring box once more, but this time, inside was a new ring, engraved with words that brought tears to my eyes, for Evelyn, forever. In that moment, I knew the fight was over, and the victory was mine. The estate was mine to protect, to nurture, and to pass on with truth and honor. Thank you for following this journey. If you were moved by Evelyn's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and empower. Your support means everything.